My name's Mary Jane Parker. I was born here, and I've lived here since, except for grad school and a year of teaching in South Dakota. So,
And so what is your role? What do you do here in New Orleans?
well, I'm an artist, and I also teach at the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, referred to as NOCA. It's an arts high school where students come for visual arts, performing arts, creative writing, and I'm the chair of the visual arts department, and I teach printmaking.
So would you tell me a little bit about your work? Because we were looking at the photos and collections that you have online. But you're a mixed media artist, and I would just like to know a little bit more about your various collections and
Okay.
what maybe drove you to create them.
Okay. Well, I work with a lot of different media, particularly printmaking and encaustic and glass. I use all those interchangeably. And I think that probably the main body of my work is reflecting some of the studies of hysteria from the 1800s during the time that Charcot was at the hospital in Paris working with women who were not considered acceptable in society because they did things that were out of the norm. And they were hospitalized because they were considered outrageous, I guess. So I did a kind of pivotal body of work that I did were sky charts and sky watching, where I paired the hysterical women's figures with constellations and created the hemispheres with the women floating in them, kind of as a way of releasing them and drawing attention to the situation. And then the work that I've done since then has kind of sometimes veered away from that. I think right after Katrina, I did a lot of things that had to do with nature and was looking at a lot of the vines that you see in New Orleans that completely cover houses. And after Katrina, everything was very dead and mud and everywhere. And then things started growing and overtaking things, and it was like this lush covering all over the city. And so I started, I used encaustic a lot, and in encaustic it involves wax, and so it has to be heated each time you add a layer to it. And it's very easy to lose the image completely in the heating process. So I was starting to cut a lot of stencils and using the stencils in the wax. And as I was cutting the stencils and laying, kind of hanging them on my studio wall, I realized that the stencils were actually as beautiful as the finished encaustic painting. So I started cutting stencils of the vines that I was taking pictures of around the city. And that led me to starting to look at lace and doilies and using that as a sort of reference of how humans organize nature in ways that make it beautiful for us. And so I was pairing the vines with the lace, and then they started to become part of these collections of faces that were covered with either plants or lace. And that was a way of sort of talking about memory and layers of memory and hiding things and drawing attention to things. So kind of, I think that brings it to present pretty much.
Awesome. And really interesting, I noticed one of it was a wooden box with the stars captured in it, is that right?
Yeah,
Can
that
you
was...
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, those were what I called specimen boxes, and it was those were pre-Katrina, and they were based on the idea of containing or holding on to things that we can't hold on to. And so in some of them I was pairing the stars with blood vessels, so it was kind of the micro-macro idea of something really vast that we can't contain, but then something small that we don't see except through microscopic. And then that led me to the star box, which was the just little jars of stars as though they were petri dishes, and looking at the stars in the way that we look at blood vessels or inner workings of our bodies.
I really like the way your collections pull together collections of ideas
Uh-huh.
symbolically. It's really,
Yeah.
really quite fascinating.
Sometimes I look at my work and I feel like it goes all over the place, but then when I talk about it, it actually makes sense in terms of a thread.
So you've talked about pre and post Katrina. Would you tell me a little bit about sort of your role as an artist or in the art environment here, pre and post Katrina?
Yeah, sure. I've really been working since I got back from grad school in New Orleans as an artist, and originally I started showing when I was first doing work at Bienville Gallery, which was many years ago in the 80s, late 80s. The kind of alternative gallery space was along Magazine Street instead of the St. Claude area that it is now. And so I showed at Bienville, which was kind of an alternative space. It was run by Ed Wiegand, who was quite a good gallery dealer, but he had MS, so he deteriorated over time. And so eventually and the work I was doing then was very dark. It was based on a kind of domestic violent relationship I had with when I'm in my first marriage. And so they were kind of tumultuous, very brightly colored, but chaotic in the way that they were drawn. And then I started showing at Arthur Roger Gallery and continued to sort of do similar work, but then worked in a lot of different other approaches. And I think that's when my work evolved into the things I'm doing more now. My husband and I are both artists, so he's a sculptor and I'm mostly a 2D person, but that was how I got into glass, and he had glass background from LSU. And I would say that we were both pretty involved in trying to draw attention to a lot of different art that wasn't just gallery art, and really kind of looking at making work that was a little more edgy and not so much decorative and so I think that's why we gravitated to Bienville and had many shows there that allowed us to sort of make work that we wanted to make that we knew maybe wouldn't sell. And during that time, I worked for a little bit of time at NOMA in the New Orleans Museum of Art. I was the curator of education, so I trained the docents and helped with all the education activities. It was a very small department back then, and I wasn't paid very well. So I eventually decided that if I really wanted to be an artist, I needed to do something that allowed me more time in the studio. So I took a job with a program that is now defunct, but unfortunately it was called Arts Connection, and it was a program for teaching art to elementary students in the classroom with the classroom teacher, so a partnership with the classroom teacher instead of release time. And we did planning with the teacher and developed projects that related to the curriculum. And I did that for probably about 13 years part-time, which allowed me to have 5 days in the studio and 3 days teaching, which was really great. And it was also exhausting, and I don't think I could have done it for full-time. 35 kids or something like that with one teacher who sometimes wasn't that engaged was tricky. But it was a great program, and it allowed me to be an artist and to also be a teacher and make a living. All during this time, my husband and I shared a studio at a place called Studio Inferno, which was started by 3 local artists. Now it's owned by one of the original owners, Mitchell Godet. And that we basically, we were very bohemian. We lived on Ray Street for $225 a month and got free studio space for helping them build the walls in the space that was a big warehouse and dividing it up into studios and things like that. So we were very involved in that group of people and being able to learn glass and do things like that were a little bit outside what my normal practice was. So
I still have Studio Inferno projects and Christmas
Oh, yeah.
apartments from when I lived in.
They're still here. They're just moved across the industrial canal, which,
Oh, they did, okay.
yeah, so Mitchell sold this building because the Bywater is becoming very pricey, and his taxes were going up so high that he decided to just go across the industrial canal into Araby, and he bought this really great building over there that he's using. And then we rent from his wife, Erica, who's down on the levee, so in the same area. So we moved with him, more or less.
So would you talk a little bit more about the education environment for art education pre and post Katrina?
Sure, yeah.
That was quite a bit of pre. What's going on now?
Well, I think, I don't know that there's much more. One of the things that schools always had, and I think it was sort of the only thing that any student could depend on, was the Talented in the Art program, which is a pull-out program where the students have to be tested and are given services if they're considered talented. The reason I think Arts Connection was such a great thing was that it really sort of saw there was a void in art education in the schools, and it started to kind of try to fill that. And for instance, Lusher is an example of a school that had a dance and a theater teacher for most of the time that I was in Arts Connection, and now it's sort of moved into a full-day art program, and they have an art program in the afternoons for students that go to Lusher. But I think that Arts Connection happened because there really wasn't much going on in the arts, and high schools have their art high school programs, but it's an elective and students have to take it if they choose to. Arts Connection fizzled out before Katrina. It was just with each new superintendent that came in, they kept whittling away at it, and it eventually became a release time program, which was not the nature of it. One of the artists in town, Allison Stewart, and her husband Hutch, saw that was starting to go away, and they started a program called KidSmart, and they've been running that since then. And it's very much in the model of Arts Connection, where the artist teachers go in and work with elementary students. And it never really worked very well in junior high because of the changing classes and the not really having a single teacher. But elementary school worked great because there was a partnership that worked out. And some of the teachers who were partners with artists actually started teaching. The whole idea was it was a professional development program on site. And so some of those teachers actually started teaching in the schools or started doing projects and using the artists that was still there as a kind of resource, which was really great.
It worked.
Yeah, yeah. These days, the school system is so fragmented, it's kind of hard to know what's going on. It used to be that everyone was Orleans Parish schools, and there were very few charter schools. Even the schools that were Arts Connection made a choice to be a part of it. They didn't all get it. And but now with the charter schools, everyone has different schedules. They all have different. In fact, even the talented program, I think, is a little fragmented because charter schools have to decide whether to have a talented teacher. Although it was always my understanding that talented kids were required to have services once they were identified, but I don't know how that's working now.
So would you talk a little bit about NOLA and sort of what is happening there, and also more about your role there?
Well, I was hired at NOCA in 1999, which was the last year we were in the old building here uptown, and moved with them to the new building. And at that point, we became a state agency. And so originally NOCA was part of the Orleans Parish school system. We kind of flew under the radar a little bit, and nobody bothered what we were doing. But when we moved to the new building, it was so much more upkeep and such really wanting it to stay at a level that was a state-of-the-art program, that the administration decided to to write legislation to make it a state agency. So the board is made up of people that are written into the legislation that are from the NOCA Institute, which is the 501c3 group, and then legislators, people who are alumni or faculty are on the board. So it's a kind of broad spectrum of people who serve on the board. And during Katrina, NOCA was taken over by the National Guard, and we were not allowed to use the campus. And so I'll get back to that. But it was quite a weird year. But since then, the director who was there over the Katrina time has moved on, and we've had someone in place for about 8 years who's worked well with the faculty, and it's grown significantly, partly because of the NOCA Institute. They have their own board. They're separate from NOCA, and they raise money to do things. And I think it was really actually before Katrina that Alan Askew and his organization came in and helped us put together a master plan. And the master plan entailed, it talked about the possibility of residential site, which hasn't happened yet. But because we're a state agency, people were trying to think of a way to make NOCA more state friendly. Even now, we have students that come from as far as like Abita Springs and every day for school, half day. And the one thing that's changed a lot is that 6 years ago, we added academics to the program, which the school used to be a half-day program. So students would go to their academics from 8 to 12 and then come to NOCA from 1:15 to 3:45. And then we also had an access program in the afternoon from 4 to 6:30. After Katrina, because Orleans Parish broke up so much, students used to get busing from their school at midday to NOCA. And when Orleans Parish divided up, actually before Katrina we had, sorry, I'm going backwards. Before Katrina we had an 8:10 to 10:45 program, and then a 1:15 to 3:45, and then 4 to 6:30 was just students like Catholic schools that wouldn't allow them to come in the morning. And that was a really great schedule because we had students when they were fresh, and now they come only at 4 to 6:30, and it's really a rough time. But it's because the Orleans Parish schools broke up and there was no busing after that. And so the busing changed a lot. And so as a result, I think they started talking about the academic program and making a program on site that would allow students to stay there all day. As it is now, only I would say about 20% of our students, 30% of our visual arts students are academic students, because they only take 60 to 70 students in their freshman year. So they have to be coming in as rising ninth graders, and they have to get into the level 1 program, which is the sort of higher level program. But we get students that audition at all different age grades, from 9 to 12. And so some students might not realize that they could come to NOCA until they're juniors, and so they apply, and then they come for a year and then still go to their academic school. So about 40% of our students, 70% of our students still go back and forth to their academic school. And I think that in some ways they actually really enjoy that more. The academic students, and it's a generalization, but so far we've noticed that the ones that are on campus all the time don't really appreciate NOCA as much as the ones who come from other schools, that they can see it's like a safe haven for them when they come to NOCA, whereas when they're in the academic program, they don't know the difference between what a high school environment might be with 600 kids or something. So NOCA now has an academic program. After Katrina, they added culinary, which is really appropriate for New Orleans with all its food. And originally NOCA had dance, music, which included jazz, vocal, and classical, and then drama, visual arts, and creative writing. I think that was it. And after Katrina, or kind of before Katrina, but didn't fully expand to that, they added media arts and a recording studio and sound and things like that. And then also musical theater, and then culinary has just been added on. So it's kind of expanded in the offerings as well in terms of the arts.
So it's interesting to me, I'm sitting here thinking about the differences between the school systems my daughter was in and this. Is it energetic? Is it confusing? I mean, it's like if I were a parent, how would I work my way through?
Not being a parent, I don't know, but I think it is very confusing. In fact, I have friends that have young children, and the elementary schools, there's quite a few really good elementary schools, but they're all charter, and so there's no district schools anymore, and students have to fill out like this common application to get in. And then I remember talking to my friend, and Caroline, I think, was one of the ones advising her, saying that if you wanted to get into one of the better elementary schools, you kind of had to go and do things and show your face and be part of the community so that people would, accept you or want you to be there, which I thought was really strange. It's like, how, when you have children and don't have time to do anything like that. But now they're all pretty much lottery. And for instance, one of the elementary schools that a friend of mine's child goes to is Hines, and it used to be just a district school, and kids could go there for whatever, and it was also an Arts Connection school. And now there's a lottery, and they have one of the few gifted pre-K, so that she was very interested in getting her child in the gifted pre-K, because then he was sort of at the beginning of the years, and he would just move on up. And so she went through all the testing and hired a private tester to get him tested and things, and got him so that he was eligible for gifted pre-K. And then she had to go to the lottery, which has these tiers, where if you're in the district, you're in one tier. If you're out of the district, you're in another tier. If you're a staff, member's child, you're in a different tier. If you have a sibling already there, so she was sitting there, and turned out there was like one more slot, and she was the one that was pulled. And it's just nerve-wracking, because her comment after they got chosen is that they felt like they'd won the lottery because they're not going to have to pay for private education. So that's sort of the dilemma I think a lot of people are in, is that if you don't get one of those slots in these good elementary schools, then you have to make the choice of sending them to a regular school that is maybe a charter school that's run by a church or a local university that may or may not be fully functioning. Or I went to right after Katrina, they had a lot of these sort of group think meetings, and I went to one on education, and Scott Cowan from Tulane was running it. And they kept talking about the charter school idea and having sort of an umbrella board that would oversee all the charter schools and make sure they were all, kind of up to the level that they should be. And I think it's more or less working, but because I hear sometimes about charter schools being closed because they had, fail and grade in the state testing and things like that. But it feels like it's very, there's no common standard. And a lot of things are kind of a little disorganized, and I think as a parent it would be very disconcerting. And I've noticed that at NOCA, is that when we first started the academic program, we would get students. We just got an onslaught of 8th graders applying to us, where we used to have a real wide range of grade levels that would apply, and some of them were just horrible at doing what they could do, but they thought, the mom was like, come on, you can draw, sit down and draw, we're getting you in this school. And I think they were just desperate for good high schools that would provide what they needed for the students.
So, your role as the head of the visual art department at NOCA, Are there things that you're working on, things you're planning? Like, what is your master plan moving forward?
Well, we have a department. We have our faculty has been there. All of us have been there since 1999, and or actually, I guess around that. I mean, we're all around 2000 that we were all hired, and so we have a really long time together. And fortunately, we all have more or less similar philosophy, and the visual arts program was set up very well in terms of its structure before I came on. And so there were certain things in place in terms of how we graded, the structure of the program. For instance, we have the students do a weekly home assignment that gets more complex as they move through the levels, and every Monday is critique. And so the students divide up into smaller groups, and faculty oversee a student-led critique, which is kind of unique to the, but those were all in place before. And the faculty has mostly just evolved that program into things like, for instance, with critique, the students used to get just a weekly assignment, and a lot of their portfolios started looking like assignments. And so when recruiters would come from some of the art schools, we would sit down and watch what they were giving scholarships to, and notice that the work was really showing thematic bodies of work by students who were graduating as seniors. And so we kind of talked to some of the students too, because some students were bringing in really terrible home assignments. And one time I remember we just sat down during critique and said, so what's up, what's going on? And they all said, well, we're doing all the work we want to do at home, but then we can't bring it in for home assignments because it's not part of the assignment. So we started doing, like 3 or 4 times through the year, we do a thematic proposal where the students are given 3 weeks, one after the other, of whatever they want to do, and they have to write a proposal about what they want to do, and then they bring in the 3 pieces that fit that idea, and then we do a few more assignments in between just to give them some structure, and then we do another thematic proposal, and they could branch off of the first proposal and do something similar so that they're carrying over the body of work. And even when they have an assignment, we try and encourage them to do something that fits the theme, fits the assignment, but also kind of carries on their ideas so that they're starting to think more as an artist. And that's really helped a lot in terms of the portfolios, and they're really getting some things together. And then every faculty brings something to it, and one of the things that one faculty member did recently is he decided that he wanted to have the students see that there were a lot of different kind of careers in the arts, and we have a lot of alums who go off and do different things that are kind of tangential to what they might have learned at NOCA. And so he started contacting alums who were doing different kinds of things, and 4 times a year he has them come in and do a little 20-minute presentation about what they're doing. And we had one student who opened a tattoo museum in New Orleans and does tattoos, so he came and talked about his work, and then they stay and work into the critique. So they'll work with either the level 3 or 4s, the more advanced students, and just kind of conduct the critique. And they have the option of sending an assignment ahead of time, so the students can do the assignment that they send. So that's been, things like that happen kind of spontaneously, because a faculty member might bring it up and say, what about this, or what about this? And it seems to kind of evolve nicely.
Sounds like a really rich program.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about sort of the art scene, and I guess, Martin, you had mentioned earlier working 3 days a week in the school system and then 5 days as an artist. Where are you now in that mix? And what is sort of the economic situation for artists in New Orleans in general?
Well, actually, Katrina changed the art scene in New Orleans significantly. I felt it was a little strange for me, because I used to know everybody, and everyone knew who I was. And as after Katrina, one of the things that happened was there was a panel discussion where Arthur Roger brought in several people from outside the city just to talk about how the cultural economy was going to move forward post-Katrina. And one of the people on the panel was Dan Cameron, who's a curator. And he said, I think New Orleans should be a hub for international art. It's sort of like prime for that kind of thing to happen. And maybe this is the impetus to make it happen. And so I think that he didn't realize he was proposing something, but then as a result of that, Prospect New Orleans started, which is the biennial. I think they're now considered triennials, but they were big international shows that he did the first two, and then I think after that they brought in guest curators. But what happened is that a lot of young people had come in to help rebuild the city and volunteered and then stayed. And it was very cheap to live here because nothing was really rebuilt yet. And a lot of people gravitated to the St. Claude area because that was one of the dry areas. It didn't have flooding, and there was a lot of the St. Claude area was starting to get a little more upscale, but there was still a lot of housing there that wasn't upscale yet. A lot of things that could be fixed up or just squatted in, kind of, and over across St. Claude was definitely like that. So a lot of artists came in, young artists, and Prospect, they decided to start some collectives or have some kind of venue where they could be seen during the Prospect audience. And that was where all the different collectives on St. Claude started from and have continued and maintained themselves, which is really surprising. Everyone thought they'd be a flash in the pan and gone after the Prospect left, but they stayed on. And so it's developed a whole body of artists who are not necessarily from universities here. Sometimes some of the Good Children is kind of a UNO based, or started as UNO. So that one has a little connection, but it's a lot of just people who just come out and similar to what Magazine Street used to be, where they want to show and don't get into a regular gallery or are doing more kind of experimental work, and so that's kind of where that's come from. And I think it's energized the city a lot because you see a lot of things, but I went through kind of a identity crisis because I felt like I didn't know anyone anymore, and that there was this whole new scene that I wasn't part of, and I started feeling very old, and so yeah, it was tricky, but I've kind of made peace with it. And as a full-time art teacher, I unfortunately do a lot of my work on the weekends and summer, and I feel a little disconnected during the school year, but then I get reconnected in the summer. It's not ideal, but it works for me. And I have toyed with the idea of dropping back a little bit on my hours at NOCA, or dropping back from being chairman. And maybe that'll happen, I don't know. It's hard to say.
So I usually try to give everybody the opportunity. This project, I don't know if I told you, grew out of friends of mine here being somewhat dissatisfied with how New Orleans was being portrayed through the media. And, as part of the resurgence and uprising, and no, we're here and we're fine and we're resilient, they kind of wanted to have their own voices out there. And I'm like, okay, yeah, we can do that. So part of what I do in each of these interviews is ask if there are things that you want people who are not from this area, may never visit New Orleans, to know about New Orleans, and from your perspective.
Well, one thing I would say from a personal perspective is I'm in a much better situation since Katrina as a result of my husband and I laugh that our house gets better from disaster to disaster because we had a hailstorm and got a new roof, and then we had Katrina and were able to expand our kitchen and sort of take a wall out, which things we wouldn't have been able to afford to do without insurance. And I feel like our neighborhood has changed a lot. I live in Mid-City, so I'm kind of right in the middle of everything. Used to be a really tricky area because we were between Jeff Davis and Broad, and there was a lot of drug dealing and low-income housing, and I think they're still there, but the people who were living off drug money have moved on or didn't come back. It's sort of unfortunate. I don't. It was a little bit of, people say it washed away the bad. It did a little bit. It did. It made the people who could come back able to, and then some who were maybe not the best neighbors moved on and weren't able to come back or something like that. And so the neighborhood has changed a lot, and I'm trying to think of. I just feel like there's more attention to building the city again, and I was really disappointed that that Nagin was reelected as the mayor. I think we would have moved more quickly. I remember when Katrina hit, so many things were going through our minds, and I remember being. I originally evacuated to my sister's in-laws in New Iberia, and then when we saw it was going to be a long-term thing, we moved to Denham Springs to a colleague of my brother-in-law. And I remember talking to my sister on the phone, and she said, "You should be prepared, you might lose your job." And I was like, they wouldn't do that to us. They wouldn't do that now while we're all down, they'd knock us while we're down. And sure enough, a lot of people lost their jobs. And then when Nagin came in, I think, I remember my husband and I talking, and he said, "I think it's going to be 10 years before we really see things start to be normal again." And it really was. It was about that long. And I think it would have moved faster if Landrew had been there, and when we'd been able to see things kind of get going. It was really amazing to watch all the people who came in from out of town to come and help. And I think that's what has resurged the city, because so many young people have stayed, and there's all kinds of Idea Village and entrepreneurial groups that are helping young people get started with a business. And so it's really been interesting to watch that happen, and I think it's become a younger city as a result of Katrina. So.
Thank you.
Okay.
I usually let folks ask questions too.
Sure.
If there are questions, anyone have questions for me?
When you're talking about the schools, I mean, there must be such a gap between, like, an education between the kids that are put on that fast, or like the accelerated track at such a young age, and then the kids that don't get into like the charter schools or just better schools at all. I mean, is that getting worse with, or like?
I think that it's actually a little bit better. There used to be some schools that were so dysfunctional that I don't think I don't think they could even really hold class in some cases. I'm getting so cold, but I'm sort of shivering a bit, but that's okay. But I think that they were. I think in that respect, it's better. I mean, I think there is some oversight, and like I said, I'm not really an expert in how the schools are functioning now, but it does look better. But I think that some of the schools just changed the flavor of the school. Like McMain High School, which is nearby, used to be kind of an overflow for Franklin, and students who either were in Franklin and didn't really want to do the rigor that Franklin was requiring would move to McMain, which was still a good school and good high school. And we used to get a lot of students from both Franklin and McMain to come to NOCA. Now we hardly get any McMain students. And I don't know whether it's that the climate of the school has changed or if it's just that they don't want to come all the way across town or whatever. But I mean, a lot of my perspective is just on the students who come to us and how I see their functioning in their schools. And you know, some of the, like McDonough 15 used to, McDonough 35 was always a really strong school for predominantly African American students, and it's remained that way. And I think it may have had a little dip, and now it's back, you know, kind of moving up forward again.
So the public school system in general, do you think it's changed as a result of Katrina?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And in general, which way would you say it's changed?
Well, it's. I think there were problems with Orleans Parish School District in general because it was just too big, and I think there probably should have been smaller districts, you know, made up of different boards or something that could oversee it, because it was just a huge number of schools, and I think things flew under the radar and didn't really get taken care of. And teachers that maybe weren't functioning well were just transferred from one school to another instead of being asked to leave. And I think the tenure and union were all kind of part of keeping that going. I was very appreciative of the union because when I was in Orleans Parish Schools, I had great benefits and things like that, but it did have its underside as well. And now that it's charter, I think there's a little more accountability, and the boards oversee each of the charter schools, and they have more say-so. They have more direct involvement in the schools. So one board might oversee maybe 4 high schools or something, as opposed to 100 or something. I don't know how many were in the old system, but it changed a lot in that respect. I think that it's too bad that there aren't schools that are more district-based, or that kids can't just go to their school in their own area. But that's just my parents grew up in New York, and they were used to going to the school that was in their city, and that was kind of how things worked up, you know. That was what I was brought up thinking. My dad worked a lot. When he first moved here, he worked a lot in the civic organizations to try to get public schools built that were within a walking distance of schools, of people's homes. And I had the benefit of going to some really good public schools because they started as a result of him being involved in making sure they happened. And now there's some really, really great elementary schools that have actually started as a result of just parents getting together and starting schools. Like Morris Jeff is an elementary school in Mid-City that kind of lived in a temporary home for a while, and then eventually got their own school. But their whole mission is to try to be as diverse as possible, and to not, you know, to be a community school that reflects the community. And then, Plessy, the Plessy School on St. Claude is another that was started by parents that just wanted to see something develop that was that was reflective of their community and that was of high quality for the students. So.
Other questions?
She's freezing. Let's get her out.
Oh, okay. I can manage. Did you have a question?
I was gonna ask, like, how important do you think it is for kids to see art on an equal level as like other disciplines?
Oh, I think it's really important, and I think that's why the Arts Connection program for me was so great, was that it was like kindergarten kids seeing artwork and reflecting on it. Sometimes I feel at a disadvantage in New Orleans because we just don't have a lot around us. We can't just walk kids over to the Met or drive them to. And I think it sort of drove the point home because I used to go to Paris a lot because I have a friend that lives there, and I would go in the summers, and her partner who grew up in Paris was talking about how they would just walk out of their school and walk into an institution that had an art thing going on, or they would just look at the architecture in their own environment. And he grew up just feeling that culture was rich everywhere because he had such a great experience. And so I think it's really amazing to me that students aren't exposed to that at at every level, and so. But I'm an art teacher, so.